Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for joining or indeed sticking with us today. What a day it's been. I've really enjoyed the content, and we are carrying on the conversation around inclusion with this panel discussion. It's something that we've spoken about quite a lot today. If you've missed Leng's opening talk on allyship, I really do recommend giving that a watch, as in my opinion, certainly nailing allyship, I think, will really help us create a more inclusive world. Actually, I was going to say business place, but actually sort of workplace, but actually it is world. It's something that we can embed in all of our lives and become more inclusive. So I really do recommend that. But today and for this panel, we are going to focus on the workplace in particular. We've obviously discussed this a lot in the past. It's one of the key themes around Be Inspired, and something that it is a clear strand running through everything we do. But I think it's becoming more widely agreed that this isn't just something for the HR department to take on now. This is something that we all need to engage with. So today we're going to look at what sort of every individual can be doing to ensure that diversity and inclusion, and in particular creating that inclusive culture, is embedded in your everyday, and how you as an individual can get that leadership buy-in for when you have those big ideas around D&I. So, what can you be doing in your daily work, and how can you get those big ideas sold into management? Hopefully we'll be able to uncover this today, and I'm really, really pleased to welcome our panel here. We've got Nathaniel, Monica and Joanna to join us today. Thank you so much for joining us. Now, to start, I would like to get a sort of short overview from you all about your own organisations. What is the company culture like where you work, and where do you think you excel, and where do you think maybe there are improvements to be made? I realise this is a huge question, but hopefully you can answer relatively succinctly. Joanna, I'm going to come to you first, if that's okay, because you are the first person on my screen.
Great, thanks Jade, and thanks for having me. So as Grays, we very much feel like our culture comes from our values and where the brand and business started at the very beginning. It was originally very much a kind of food tech startup that went into snacking. And so we have values like being fueled by data, and that very much kind of runs through the veins of everyone in the company. And then we've got values like altogether unique, which is very much kind of talking to that agenda around diversity and inclusion, where we've got some great sort of spotlights within the business, but certainly room to grow more. And I think we're on a real journey with that. It's not something that we've kind of cracked in our days of growing into a more mature business. But it's definitely an agenda that I know everyone across the business feels super passionate about.
I think that's a really nice submission, and one that I've heard from a lot of leaders, actually, that I think a lot of people are on a journey with it, and I think we can see within the industry that we're not quite there yet. I think that there is a lot of progress to be made, but actually being on that journey is key, really, to making those changes and making a more inclusive workplace. Nathaniel, you are next on my screen, so can I come to you for the same question? What is the company culture like at Wakuda, and where do you think you excel, and where do you think improvements could be made?
Thank you. So at Wakuda, I'll probably describe the company culture as very authentic. We're quite a new startup, so our team's quite small. We actually had the time to put together our mission statement and values as a team, so it allows us to, I suppose, genuinely challenge and have conversations, because we're all coming from the same place, but we all kind of put together that map. In terms of improvement, I'll probably say more conversations and more different communities engaging with our brand and actually coming on board. But I think that's more to do with time and growth more than anything else.
It's interesting you mention you're a startup, and Joanna, you mentioned that Grays came from kind of startup roots, and I wonder how maybe that makes things a little bit easier to have these conversations when you sort of come from that background and that kind of smaller team that's grown bigger, whether that allows a sort of more inclusive environment. Monica, can I come to you next? Because actually you're not from a startup, are you? Estee Lauder Companies is definitely rather bigger than a startup. What is the company culture like there, and where do you think you're kind of nailing it, and where can improvements be made?
Yeah, I mean, we're absolutely not a startup. We are a family company that we have a rich, deep-rooted history, and we were founded 75 years ago. And I think when Mrs. Estee Lauder founded us, she was an innovator in her own right. She invented what the beauty market looked like, and that really inspires us today. But I think a lot of the values that we had with Mrs. Estee Lauder when she started the company still live with us today. So of course we're beauty inspired, but we talk a lot about being values driven. That it's about not only the positive impact that we can have on employees, but it's about community, it's about planets. And I think what's really important is your value systems are not something that changes, right? Your values, your mission, those are things that are kind of the constant, but it's how you adapt those values to shifts that you might be seeing in society, whether it be increased focus on sustainability or, importance on social impact. And of course, as you mentioned earlier, inclusion, diversity, and equity is not a new conversation. I think one of the benefits that we do have being such a large organization is we're present in 150 countries worldwide. So we already have a built-in global community of employees and partners and consumers. So that idea of diversity of thought and experience is kind of embedded into the enterprise. But very much like Joanna said, and you said, Jade, it is a journey. ID&E is not something that you do or that you finish. It's a constant continuum. And so it's thinking about the different initiatives and things you put into action today that kind of help you for a long-term, progress and success for tomorrow.
I think you're so right. It is a continuum, I think was the word you used. It is something that is constantly building. And like you say, it's so important to listen to those new ideas that are coming to the fore every day and listening to that community. Joanna, I'd like to come back to you for my next question, which kind of leads on from that. Obviously, there will be a lot of people watching here today that have perhaps bigger ideas around D&I and perhaps ways that they might want to get leadership buy-in. As a chief exec, what would make you kind of stop and listen to one of those ideas, and kind of what advice would you give for somebody trying to sell an idea into leadership?
I think it starts, and one of the reasons why I'm personally really invested in what does this enable the business to do better than it was doing before. And I think the business case has been well articulated now around the value of diverse cultures and diverse communities. Ultimately, my vested interest as a chief exec is serving the people who want to enjoy great snacks better than we do today, that we can do in the future. And the reality is we operate in a market which is super diverse, whether that's from an ethnicity perspective, from a disability, from a gender perspective. And I genuinely believe that you will serve people better if you have that diverse kind of foundation within your own business. So the encouragement I would always make to any of my team is, help me understand how it's going to have a business impact, as well as, obviously being the right thing for us to do. And then I think as a leader, our responsibility is to create those forums for people to raise those ideas and those opportunities, whether that can be a really small one-to-one conversation, or it's raising the profile and opening a debate at a company level. And I think you have to use all of those tools to make sure that those ideas, which are always great, are being surfaced.
I think that's something that's come up actually in a lot of conversations I've had with our ambassadors, is about creating those forums and those networks so that people feel like they have a voice. I'd like to actually come to you, Monica, next, because Joanna, you touched upon a question that I sort of wanted to ask Monica about, given that, Monica, your role kind of encompasses many facets of D&I, and including from a consumer point of view. And Joanna, obviously you touched on the idea that in order to serve your consumers consumers, you have to have these things in mind. How are consumers and their demands of brands, particularly within beauty, as I know that kind of area is very switched on in the D&I space, how are they actually shaping how you at Estee Lauder companies are approaching your internal D&I strategy?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think Joanna really did sort of, hit the nail on the head by saying you have to have a diverse workforce, to think about different perspectives, to think about, experiences so that you can create inclusive campaigns, inclusive initiatives. It's about living those ID&E principles internally, but also living them out externally. And one of the benefits I have with my role is, I sort of say I have two hats. Same coin, two different sides. So one is the internal aspect of I&D, but the other is a function that we've long had in the business, which is heading up local and cultural relevance. And so it's about how do we think about all of our consumers, especially when we think about emerging populations. So whether that be across age cohorts, your Gen X, but also your ageless consumer, your multi-ethnic consumers, and how, at the end of the day, I think we can all agree that everyone wants to feel beautiful, right? But what beauty looks like, what beauty feels like is very different for everybody, very much, influenced by culture, what you were surrounded by, how you grew up with beauty as a part of your everyday life. And so as our team, we really try to think about what are those points of uniqueness that we need to dial up, that we need to think about in a different way, whether it be from visualization, education, lexicon, so that we are really being able to satisfy anybody's beauty goals or needs. And, diversity in beauty is a conversation that's been going on for a long time. And I think we have sort of been in a position where we've been having a conversation for a long time as well. MAC Cosmetics has been embodying their motto of all ages, all races, all genders from inception in 1984. They have been speaking to men about makeup, to the trans community. From a social impact standpoint, they have their charitable Viva Glam campaign, that has generated $500 million since inception in 1984, really to support equal rights for women, girls, the LGBTQIA plus community. And so I think a lot of this ethos around diversity and beauty has been embedded in the organization for a really long time. And it's just, like I said, how we evolve, how we continue to think about emerging populations internally and externally so that we are very relevant and very authentic in who we partner with and how we connect with the consumer.
It's interesting, actually, the way you talk about that. So sort of embedding it within business. It kind of then means that naturally everybody in their role every day is thinking about inclusivity. So that's going to have that kind of impact on how it feels to work within your organization, because if that's something that if that's something that's on your to-do list, you have to do this. If you don't do it, your manager's going to be breathing down your neck and asking you why you haven't done it. Naturally, that's going to sort of permeate the culture of the organization, which I think is really interesting. And it's almost like if we can kind of do good for the world, we're doing good for ourselves, we're doing good for our colleagues. It's kind of a circular thing. I'd like to actually pick up on that and ask the entire panel, with that in mind, kind of how do you go about making a difference in diversity and inclusion when your role has nothing to do with it? So I don't know, you work in supply chain, you work in logistics, or perhaps you're working in an area of the business that just doesn't, D&I isn't necessarily at the forefront. You're not in HR, arguably marketing at the moment is focused quite heavily on D&I. You're not in these kind of roles where it's something that's the focus. What, in your view, everyone on the panel, can each individual do on a daily basis to be influencing this agenda? What should people have in mind when they turn up at their desks, whether that's at home at the moment or in an office, or indeed whether it's on the shop floor? What should they have in mind to create that inclusive culture themselves? I am going to pick on Nathaniel first, if that's okay. Can we hear from you?
Sure. I don't necessarily think any role doesn't have diversity and inclusion in it. I think just because a job description doesn't have D&I in the criteria, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's not part of each individual's collective responsibility to influence that agenda. And in terms of actually actions that people can take, I think just self-awareness, reflection on bias, actions we take, why we take certain actions. And it's not necessarily about always going back and thinking about things in hindsight, but sometimes it's about, okay, when I'm faced with this type of person, when I'm in this type of situation, this is probably what I need to do moving forward. I think it's just about, that's an action that everyone can take regardless of role, I think.
Yeah, I think it's interesting you say that, and it chimes back. I would say, I'm going to do a shameless plug to an earlier session. If you haven't watched it, get it on demand. Toby Milden, who's a D&I architect, did a session earlier today on unconscious bias and privilege, and kind of understanding where that might come from. And it's really natural, and actually everybody has that, but just being aware of it, I think that self-awareness piece is really key. Joanna, can I come to you next? What in your view do you think every individual can do day to day to influence the inclusivity of a company culture?
Yeah, I would really echo what Nathaniel said. I think diversity matters irrespective of what your role is within a company. I think it is for everyone's benefit to have it in mind. I think from a business perspective, I often see the most diverse teams are the ones who are the most creative with coming up with a solution. They are the best problem solvers. And that's an area, those are skills that you want across your entire business, not in any one area. I think then the reflection I've made certainly, in the last sort of couple of years is, how can I become more informed? How can I be more educated? How can I realize my own unconscious bias? There are so many great books, podcasts, articles out there today. I listened to a super one last week, Adam Grant, How to Build an Anti-Racist Workplace. Those desire to be curious, to understand, to learn, I think we can only as leaders just kind of demonstrate our commitment to that, and then hope that expectation flows through our organizations as well.
Yeah, definitely. And thank you for mentioning that podcast. It's always really helpful to get resources that we can pass on afterwards. So that's great. And Monica, what do you think? What in your view can each individual be doing daily?
Yeah, I mean, not to sort of say what Nathaniel and Joanna have said, but yeah, I think every role has a vested responsibility. I think when you think about these principles, these are things that can't live in a silo, right? It's not about one team or one leader who has to make the movement, because the idea is ID&E shouldn't be about race or shouldn't be about gender. It really is inclusive principles. And so everyone needs to be a part of the conversation, and so I think one thing, we talk a lot about the business impact, and, rightly so, there have been a lot of published papers and, kind of advocating why it's so important. But I think we have to remember that we shouldn't shy away from leading into the emotional aspect of ID&E as well. Being able to push boundaries a little bit, getting a little bit past that fear and discomfort. Joanna talked a lot about, presenting ideas to leaders, addressing a pain point that maybe has come across the business or that kind of ties into a strategic imperative. And I think, the idea of education, unconscious bias, I think, is incredible in terms of kickstarting conversations, taking a moment to reflect and think, okay, I didn't realize this bias that I might have. But I also think it's those small, very powerful gestures, and asking questions and educating yourself. So if you don't know how to pronounce somebody's name, just ask them. Or if you're not sure about what gender pronoun they are, just ask, kind of breaking down those barriers and having those conversations, I think, are really important. I think one of the ways that we have also found in our organization that has been very, powerful, and given that we are a large organization, is employee resource groups. I think they really provide this idea of community. They allow another opportunity for voices to be heard. It gives you diversity of thought and perspective. initiative. And, these employee resource groups continue to grow, not only in the number of groups that you might have in an organization, but the number of members who join. So I think that's been, a really powerful tool. And the last point I would say, I think transparency and communication across the business is key. I think sometimes when we think about these principles, you're having a conversation here, but all the teams here have no idea what's happening. And so this idea of transparency, communication, what commitments are you making? Not only are you sharing those commitments, but are you sharing the progress that you're making? Are you sharing the next steps? And then kind of walking the walk, not only talking about it internally, a lot of our commitments we will be publishing externally on our websites. So really just holding everyone and making sure that we're all part of the conversation. We all know what's happening and what progress we're making along the way.
Yeah, I think that's really key. And I think what you said as well about the whole piece around getting uncomfortable and being happy to kind of ask those questions and, accepting that we can't know everything, but actually people are quite receptive if you just ask, and that's a key part of culture really is if you can make it so that people are free to ask and people are free to respond, then you've kind of nailed it really. Nathaniel, I'd like to come back to you because I know you were featured in our video that I believe is going to be shown at the start of this panel and at the end of the conference. What do you sort of define as success when it comes to inclusivity? It's a big question, but I'm gonna put you on the spot.
It's a massive one. I think pretty similar to what Monica said is like it's a journey, and Joanna as well. It's a continuum. There's no end goal. You can make progress, and I think a milestone to that progress is all people, regardless of abilities, disabilities, healthcare needs, and others, are respected and appreciated as valuable members of their community. And I think that's a good point to be at, but it's not to say that there's not other elements and work to do to create a fully inclusive workplace. I think fairness, accountability, there's so much collaboration. They just have a lot to do with creating that environment where everyone feels acknowledged. It's not black and white, obviously. And I think it's about commitment as well, and commitment across the board.
I think you're absolutely right. And I think that's a really nice note to end on. And hopefully, everybody watching today can take something from what we've discussed here and commit, like you say, to being more inclusive. I think one key thing that has definitely sort of struck me today is it's definitely about listening. It's about being open, and it's about having that kind of empathetic approach to everything you do in your day-to-day. And I think if we can all kind of keep that in mind, then we'll naturally educate each other, and we will naturally ensure that everybody, like you said, Nathaniel, feels that they have a voice and that they can be listened to. I really do hope that everybody listening today has come away with something that they can take back to their own workplace and hopefully action as of tomorrow. I also really appreciate the suggestions that you've made for getting buy-in with leadership. So if you have got that big idea, if you're sat there thinking, we need to create this network group, or we need to celebrate this event, or if you've got that big idea, just do it, get it done, have a chat with your leadership team. And these guys on the panel today are all leaders in their own businesses and clearly are very receptive to these things. So hopefully that will be the same for you wherever you are working right now. Thank you, Joanna, Nathaniel and Monica, for joining us, and thank you for all your insight. I will now hand back to Ria.